Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those joining us from the US, and welcome to today's webinar entitled How to Optimize Your Forms for Maximum Success. My name is Linus Gregoriadis, the Global Director of Research and Intelligence at ClickZ, and I'll be moderating and one of the presenters today. This webcast, in partnership with Phosphor, will look at tips and best practice which can help reduce online friction and increase trust for website users. Please note that we'll be recording today's webcast and will create an on-demand version that will be available soon after the webinar's conclusion. This webcast will feature a panel discussion, so please feel free to submit your questions via the webinar platform at any time during the presentation. Okay, so I'm now delighted to introduce my fellow panelists, whom you can see pictured on this slide. Let's start with Jonathan.
Hello everyone, my name's Jonathan Atwood. I'm CEO of an organisation called Phosphor, and essentially we help online businesses optimise their customer journeys with a particular focus on optimising forms.
Great, thanks. James?
Yeah, hi, I'm James Gerd. I'm the owner of Digital Juggler, and I'm an independent e-commerce consultant. I've worked with a wide range of B2B and B2C clients, helping them with online UX and user journey improvements, of which form optimization is a part.
Great, and finally, Leah.
Hi, I'm Leah Eiler. I'm based in New York City and work with Phosphor as the head of US growth, focused on enhancing products, working with our customers and clients to tackle things in terms of optimization of their marketing.
Fantastic, thanks Leah. So we'll be hearing more from these guys a bit later. So just to set the scene a bit more, really wanted to stress how important the online forms are for being a vital part of the online customer experience, whether the aim is to sign up users to an email newsletter, a quote, or to complete a purchase. A well-designed form can minimize the time and effort required and help the user to complete the process easily. However, if the user has to spend a long time on a form or encounters problems entering their data, then they may abandon the form before completion. The cost of this can be measured in lost sign-ups, sales and leads, and it's an area of web design where attention to detail and committing to optimization can really pay off handsomely and have a measurable effect on a company's sales. With that in mind, we wanted to get a feel for how confident you are that your organization is excelling in this area. So it'd be great if you could answer the following poll question, which is about to come up. Please, Priscilla. Okay, so please, let us know whether you're very confident, quite confident, or not at all confident that your online forms are properly optimized. Okay, so for those who I guess aren't so confident, we're really hoping that this webinar will help to improve your efforts in this area. You can see here quite a famous quote on the screen, which has been doing the rounds for a few years and was used in the conversion rate optimization report produced by eConsultancy and Redeye. For every $92 spent acquiring customers, just $1 is spent converting them. So a really big imbalance there. Acquisition here refers to any marketing and advertising activity focused on making consumers aware of your brand or interested in your products and services. As for the first two stages of the marketing funnel depicted here, we can see that there has historically been a huge bias towards acquisition rather than conversion. I think over time the commercial landscape has become much more competitive and it's become harder to maintain conversion rates. So this has led to the balance being rightly addressed in recent years, with more companies increasing their investment in funnel and conversion rate optimization, but there's still a lot of revenue which companies are missing out on because of poor user experience. Wearing my consumer's hat, this is very much evident when it comes to form optimization, even though large strides have been taken to make this easier for website visitors. So still a lot of room for improvement. And this leads me on to a white paper we've recently published on form optimization. And I wanted to talk through, but based on this report, I wanted to talk through a few do's and don'ts before we hand over the reins to Jonathan at Phosphor to present a few slides. And so I'll talk through a few key pointers now, and James is going to chip in with some insights as well. Okay, firstly, let's look at form validation. While some sites wait until the user clicks to go to the next page of the form before validating, a better option is to use inline validation, as is the case here with the example from Zara. In this way, users receive instant feedback as they complete forms, meaning they adjust for any issues as they go along. It's important not to be too strict with validation. Some sites insist that postcodes, or that zip code, obviously in the US, are entered in a specific format with a space in the middle, for example. This means that entering a postcode without a space would trigger an error message. In this example from Zara, an error message is triggered due to the way the postcode or zip code has been entered. The problem here is made worse by a lack of information on the desired format. Does Zara want the user to add a space? Should the postcode be entered in capitals? This kind of confusion can cause users to abandon checkout forms and essentially is a real no-no. Next, let's look at how much information you should be asking for on a form. Users will generally understand that a certain amount of information is required to complete forms, but may become frustrated or annoyed if they feel they're being asked for unnecessary information. When designing a form, or for example a checkout, you should only ask for the information you actually really do require to complete the transaction. Anything beyond that extends the process and carries with it the risk of making form completion harder for users. For example, it's common to have a "how, where did you hear about us" field, but since analytics and other data sources can generally provide many of the answers here, then you really need to think about whether that's actually essential for your business. This is an example you can see on your screens now from B&Q, which has a mandatory title field with a limited set of options, which may cause offence, for example, to non-gender binary customers. Unless this information is being actively used or analysed, it's preferable not to ask and certainly not to make mandatory. Another common field that's asked for is date of birth. It may be useful for marketing purposes, but it isn't essential for completing a checkout form, and so some users may wonder why they're being asked this. Here, ASOS asks for this information on the first page of the checkout, and at least they promise a birthday treat, but it is a risk to include such a field. I wanted to bring in James here. James, can you add in some thoughts here on form validation and or the amount of information being asked for?
Yes, sure. On the amount of information, I think this is really important, that it's take a step back as a business user and not think about what data you need, but to think about what data a customer is going to naturally expect to give you at any stage of their user journey. It's a critical thing that UX teams are doing smarter now, is putting customer-centric thinking in, building a customer mental model of what sort of things am I expecting, because if you give people things they don't expect, it slows them down and also can make them question why they're giving information. A good example that you flagged up about date of birth is you don't have to ask for data that's useful for your CRM and segmentation purposes but isn't critical to processing the transaction that's currently taking place. You can do follow-up CRM activity once you've got people converted, and the most important thing in a checkout is converting people to sale and then looking at how you use the data later on, rather than trying to gather more data up front and slowing people down. That's especially relevant on mobile, where I've seen enough data to show that the longer and more challenging you make the form, the higher the exit rates are in general. Another good thing to think about is these generic pick lists for things like how did you hear about us, often get misused by users because they're not that fussed about answering. It's not critical to them, so they pick the first one in the list. And I've seen research that showed that actually by people putting dummy entries in the first one to expose this, and got most people selecting the first option. So you have to be careful and realise that sometimes when you add more, you actually get less quality data off the back of it.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to touch on, or is there?
No. That's great, James, and plenty of opportunities to pitch in as we go through this. So the next few charts look at errors, and specifically here, labelling of errors. While many form fields will be self-explanatory, users may need some help with others. The lesson here is that it's far better to explain about the information and required format before customers complete a field than to try and get this point across in an error message. So if we went back to that postcode entry example earlier from Zara, they should have made the required format clear before customers entered it, expecting customers to guess just annoys them. Another thing that we can see here is around passwords, which are a common problem in checkout. Understandably, retailers want customers to create more secure passwords, and this involves creating rules whereby users need to enter a mixture of lowercase and caps, to use numbers, special symbols, and so on. The problem here is Boots partly explained its rules, though it didn't really didn't really explain in the error message. And in addition to that, rather than placing the explanatory text near the relevant form field, it's further down the page where it could easily be missed, and it's very hard even to see on this chart, just as hard on the site to see because it's in light grey text. So it's best to explain in advance, or you'll infuriate potential customers. In summary, so some simple micro copy placed near form fields can help users to complete forms and avoid making errors in data entry. It's also important to use analytics to identify areas of friction and common mistakes users make on forms. And I'm sure Jonathan will be talking about this. While a redesign is sometimes necessary, many issues can be addressed with the right copy. This is a good example from Threadless. The payment form provides key information on the expected input format. It anticipates user questions about the form and addresses them effectively. So good practice there. Quickly on error messaging, the aim of form design should be to avoid having to serve error messages to users, and good design should enable sites to avoid many common errors. However, users will still make errors from time to time, and it's important to help them overcome this and continue on their journey. Error messages should be used to explain why the visitor has made a particular error and to tell them about the action or actions they need to take to rectify the problem. For example, if I've forgotten to add my email address in the correct format, the site should highlight the field where the error occurred and tell me what I need to fix. Many messages are too generic and do too little to help, using language which seems to blame the user or only alert them that there has been an error. You can see some examples here. Okay, next we wanted to look at anticipation of user errors. Naturally, the best way of handling errors is to reduce them from occurring. Errors can be reduced through judicious form design and preventative microcopy. User errors typically have three causes: omission of data, incorrect data, or data requirement problems. So the user entered data which may not meet your input requirements. James, anything to add here on error messaging or anticipation of user errors?
Yeah, so a few things for pointers. Number one is fundamentally make sure you're set up to track all the errors. So that means have event tracking on all your form fields to capture when an error happens and then capture the value that was entered and what the error type was. This is critical because you can start to drill into where you're getting frequently recurring errors and also what is the data being entered to find out, have you got a fundamental problem of how you're labelling that's misleading people, or could you put some tool tips around that field to actually make it easier for customers? The next bit is, do you actually need to alert the user to an error, or are you slowing them down unnecessarily? A good example is payment processing. So some retailers actually do queue buffering for when there's a failed payment. So not if it's obviously suspicious where all the card data is entered incorrectly, but if the payment is failed from the bank, instead of saying to the customer, right, it's failed and giving them a stop, actually putting a queue in the background, allowing them to carry on with the order, and then trying to reprocess that at a later stage before alerting the customer. There are pros and cons to this approach, but it's about policy and thinking what's the best way of minimising the impact, because sometimes it's just an issue of the communication with the bank payment system, and if you reprocess it again, you can get the transaction through. Then the next thing is clear requirements. So I'm sure we've all come across this. You hit a password field, you enter a password, it says a minimum of 6 characters. And then you realise that actually, no, you've got to put a capital in, or you might need to have one number. It's not clear and explicit, and it just drives people mad. And then the last two are around formatting. So ensuring that you pre-format fields wherever possible to minimise errors. So, for example, expiry date on a card, if all you need is month, year, in that format, be explicit, split that into 2 boxes, and only allow 2 digits entered in each box. Don't give just a standard field where people have to guess whether the year needs to be in 4 numbers or 2. And also make sure that the fields are flexible to cope with different types of data input. For example, the card security number field, does it work on Visa, MasterCard, Amex, all different cards where the security number can have a different format. So it's about thinking more intelligently about how you reduce errors as much as how you display them to users.
Okay, that's wonderful stuff. Thanks, James. So quickly on form length, it's fair to say that long forms can be off-putting for users, or they can give the impression that the process is going to be really time-consuming. Of course, some forms have to be reasonably long. Applications for car insurance quotes, for instance, are lengthy by necessity. Can also be about the customer's perception of the form. If it looks like hard work, people will assume it is. This is one of the reasons why some websites use one-page or accordion checkouts, as even though they require the same amount of information as other sites, they can seem like less work. One way to reduce form length, as we can see here, is to remove any unnecessary fields. If the form has been stripped down as much as possible, then there are still ways to reduce user effort. Small touches like allowing users to use delivery details as their billing details help and are now commonplace. Postcode or zip code lookup tools can also save time. Another option, as used by Shu, is to use predictive address tools, which actually you can see here, which suggest matching addresses as users type. 2 benefits from this. Firstly, it reduces the amount of data entry required, and secondly, it removes the need to display all the address fields, and thus has the effect of making the form seem shorter. Okay, next we're going to look at input formats and devices, which are often very interrelated. We know that mobile commerce continues to grow to the extent that form designers need to account for the various device types used to complete forms, whether tablets, smartphones in different shapes of sizes, etc. This graph sourced from Comscore data is a reminder that we're well past the tipping point a couple of years ago when more people began to access the web via their smartphones rather than desktop PCs. I saw a good quote today which basically says that the mobile web is the internet now. So forms and checkout in particular remain a common barrier to conversion on mobile devices. The answer to this problem lies in optimizing forms for mobile and tablet devices and looking for ways to make form completion easier. One way is to adapt forms for device-specific capabilities. For example, AO.com defaults to the correct version of the mobile phone keypad throughout the checkout, numerical for entering phone and card numbers, and the email keypad when entering email addresses. Quite simple, but actually clever, and it's surprising more people don't do that. So this improves the user experience for mobile shoppers and makes it more likely that they'll complete the checkout forms. It's also important to have larger input fields and buttons to avoid data entry errors by mobile users. Here, Selfridges ensures that fields are big enough and that the continue to delivery call to action is clear and easy to select on a touchscreen device. Another option is to use features such as fingerprint scan for logins or using smartphone cameras to scan credit cards and make payment entry easier for shoppers. James, anything to add here?
Yeah, just a couple of pointers again. So I think the key thing, and you touched on this, is the growth of mobile and not just mobile, but other touchscreen devices, including desktops that are touchscreen enabled. Is fundamentally think about form design for touchscreens first, and then look at that on the smaller smartphones, and then look at how you scale it up into desktop. Don't do it the other way around, because it's much harder to shrink and make a form work into a smaller device and go the other way. And also look at the data and look at what device types and operating systems people are using to access the site, and understand that there are subtle variations in the UX on Android and iPhones, and really think about the best way of sculpting that. Then it's things to make life easier again. So look at how you can accelerate form completion, specifically on mobile. For example, if you're offering PayPal checkout, you can do that from the basket page. You don't have to wait until someone's gone through the checkout and started to fill up sign-in forms. They can go direct into PayPal and accelerate their payment. Also remember to save data as much as possible to reduce data entry. If somebody pauses their checkout and comes back to forms later on, don't make them restart an individual form from the very beginning again. And the next bit is about some of the little subtleties that not many checkouts use in their forms, but are available. So there are code libraries that improve input formats. For example, there's an open source code library that automatically detects the card number based on what you're typing. It knows, from the first few digits whether it's Visa, Amex, etc. So you can cut out the need for people to say I'm paying with Visa, debit, MasterCard, etc. Take another step out. And then also use things like normalization to reduce errors and issues. A great example is postcode. Now, so many sites have an issue with when you put a space in, for example, a UK postcode, and when you don't. I had an example today on Kickstarter where I was trying to enter my postcode. I entered it, and then they said, oh, we've got a more accurate one for you. So I had to stop, think, review, and all they'd done was taken the 7-digit postcode I put in and put a space in it, which is utterly ridiculous and a waste of my time. And it's thinking about the ways that you can use sensible processes where you can recognise and normalise data without having to make the customer do another action. Okay, great. Thanks, James. So I wanted to touch very briefly on guest checkout, which is covered extensively in the white paper I've been referring to, which we produced in partnership with Phosphor. Just to summarise here, there are definitely advantages, but I think our view is that there are probably more advantages than disadvantage. Is even though if you force people to register, you can obviously reap some benefits from the additional data you're collecting. Very quickly, James, any thoughts on this? Yeah, number one is ask yourself the question, as a business, is there a legitimate compliance or commercial reason why a customer has to register? If the answer is no, then don't force them to. There are some organisations, such as membership organisations, where only members can purchase, and therefore people do need to create an account to buy. That's not a problem, but be transparent. If you don't need that, then don't obsess about it. You're going to have their email address, so you can still communicate to them afterwards, and then give them a reason on the order confirmation page when they're happier because you've given them a great checkout service, then give them the opportunity to register. M&S does it really well. You can also be more selective. So on an order confirmation page or in the order confirmation email, use a like NPS Net Promoter Score survey and find out those who are happy with what you've done and not happy. Those who are scoring 7 to 10, the passives and promoters, well, they're more likely to want to register an account because they like you and you've done well. So then go to them with an email saying, why don't you register now and get these advantages? And for the others, look at a more positive CRM to try and improve their experience of you. So I think it's more about let people choose and give them a clear path into being able to register with benefits afterwards, but don't force them into something they don't want to do.
Okay, thanks James. A quick plug for another ClickZ Intelligence report. This is the e-commerce checkout best practice guide which James has written, which will be made available for free soon, so watch this space on ClickZ. And before I hand over to Jonathan, let's have another poll question please, Priscilla. This one is around how much of a priority form optimization is for your business. Okay, great, interesting to see that. So without further ado, Jonathan, please take us away.
Hello everyone, thanks for your time. I'm just going to take you through a short story of form optimization that we put together from working with a whole range of businesses, from retail to financial services organisations, and just really sharing some of our insights and tips along the way. I think the first thing we found is that typically organisations make huge efforts to improve optimisation, but almost without exception, we find actually things don't actually get much better. And then that's against increasing acquisition costs. So something's perhaps not necessarily working. The other thing we find is there's two of the most useless stats in marketing are out there, which are my conversion rate and my dropout rate. So the amount of times we find an organisation might say, well, I've got a 90% dropout rate. That's great, but what the hell do you do with it? It actually doesn't lead to any action whatsoever, apart from tells you you're losing a lot of customers. So I think we just need to get beyond some of these aggregate numbers if we want to start making real changes and make a difference. The other thing we just observe is the customer journey world is changing, and it's changing fast. So typically we've been used to past action metrics where we focused on clicks and page impressions, but if I tell you one person's got 3 clicks and 7 page impressions, another one's done 8 clicks and 9 page impressions, that actually doesn't really help you. And when we combine that with having data in silos and various things done in the past is not where we want to be. So if you look at customers or organisations that are doing very well, they are having single customer views, they're basing action on the whole user journey, so they can not just optimize their forms, but actually start moving beyond that to personalize and predict. So yes, it's tough to optimize the customer journey, but we've certainly found focusing on forms is probably the area of biggest opportunity that's out there. So I guess the question for people that we often ask is, do you know exactly where customers are dropping out, and do you know what changes that need to be made? And we find that gets tough once you start going down those specific questions. So, for example, I challenge everyone to say, well, could they write down now what are the 3 things that have the biggest impact on their forms? Do they actually really know how mobile is working for them? And if they make a change, do they really know what impact that has on their margin? So I don't really care about clicks or page impressions, what it actually does on bottom line revenue. So it can be complicated optimizing forms. And the other thing is you just need to start thinking them beyond forms. They're actually quite complicated machines, and we're in an arms race. So if you look at a content page, that tends to be relatively simple, but a form has lots of moving parts. It's also not static, it needs constant maintenance. If you look at browsers get updated, websites get updated, so it's constantly moving. So what we certainly challenge everyone we work with is to absolutely scrutinise every single field on every single form and effectively put together a business case for it. Because yes, every field is a reason for a customer to leave, but actually if that field's got to be there, you've actually got to support and maintain that on an ongoing basis. And that's not trivial. So what we find is for form optimization, it's not a one-hit, take a few best practices and do it. You actually need a systematic process. So you actually need to start with the right tools. And a couple of observations we found is that the first thing is it's very easy to make the right decision on the wrong data. So often someone will have data on that individual form without observing the customer journey itself. So do you know what happens beyond the form in terms of did they buy, did they return an item, were they a multi-purchaser, was it a fraudulent purchase? So you need to understand the whole customer journey data to answer the form. You need to get past as well averages. Just think of averages as your complete enemy. They sound great, but they tell you nothing. The other thing is focus on the cash. This is all about making more money or reducing costs. So to give you an answer, sort of the modern tool that looks at form optimization should have a number of elements. First of all, it should be able to take all your scattered data sources, both cross-site, cross-channel, multi-device. It should have all your post-purchase data, all your cost data, all your margin data, all put together at the customer level, so you've got a granular view. We then find you need two areas. You need the ability to query and interrogate that data, and then you need very, very clear, specific tools so people who are not data scientists can understand it and make decisions. If you can't use the data, people won't take notice of it. So a few things we found. First thing is, in terms of basic setup, is to actually need to track your forms. So make sure they all have very clear URLs. You've got an ID on each form. And then the field names should be sensible. So often we see random generated field names and it's impossible to understand what's going on. So first of all, set your forms up correctly for analysis. The second thing is we talk about mobile traffic. Everyone knows all the stats about how much mobile traffic goes to sites, but time and time again, forms are not mobile optimized. So our message there is just get on and do it if you haven't done it. So then when we look at sign-up forms, in particular with mobiles, if we look at email verifications, often an interesting area. So the first thing is email verification often is sent to a mobile with a verification code. So the first thing, you're forcing someone on a multi-device journey. So the question is, can you actually track and stitch together those journeys? The second thing is, can someone then log in from the mobile? And one tip here is that we find that about 30% of people who are sent a verification via mobile forget their password within the space of a couple of minutes. So they then go straight to the password verification process, which is often one of the most overlooked forms. So suddenly they're going into a bad experience straight away. So I challenge you guys just to have a look and fix that. Another thing is, and I put "oh no" here because often we find that optional extras can be one of the best ways to reduce your revenue. So typically we found recently a number of sites we worked with that anybody who's touched the optional extras page actually has a 50% plus dropout rate. So if you look at things, sometimes you find looking at analytics, those customers, yes, they're highly engaged, but they don't buy. So one of the tips we found here is just close the sale and take the cash, then show option extras, or don't show them at all. Remember, this is all back to making money. The other thing that's become increasingly common is the concept of ghosting. So typically we find marketing teams have very limited time, and so quite rightly they want to focus on the top 3 or 4 things that impact forms. But what we find is when a site's built, it has errors from day one, and those certainly creep in over time. But what you find is after a number of years of operating, there'll be a whole long tail of issues that will cause drop-off rates in the customer journey, but particularly into the forms. So one of the things we recommend to clients is make sure you've got a tool that can capture and automate those. That long tail is worth a lot of money, and typically they're very easy things to fix. So one typical thing we find here is the county field, which it's fine back in the 1990s. So for those of you who are in the US, county is not quite like a US county, but it's become effectively obsolete. But time and time again, we find sites that ask for county field. We had one the other day that was asking people in London for their county, and it's mandatory. And ask a Londoner, and I bet 95% don't know what the county is. We'll put something up later to show the answer for those who don't know. But also we see sites that have gone from national to international, often forget. So you see a state field for non-US traffic. So just look at ghosting and fix it. The other thing we find is that, and we touched on this earlier, but people still do it, is just get the minimum amount of data. So often you find people ask for all sorts of data, from everything from name and address through to shoe size. The key thing we found here, and I think the thing I'd add to the discussion from earlier, is that often customers who perceive a form difficult to sign up to will find it their perception is it's difficult to unsubscribe to. So you're creating a perception here. So just as the guy said earlier, really focus on that. I guess this is a webinar, we've got some experts here, but we find lots of lazy forms, and the advice is partly don't listen to experts, which sort of sounds slightly counterintuitive, but there's lots of good best practice out there that's right in a lot of times, but also every form's different for every customer base, so part of the reason having a tool is use your data. The data should be the master to tell you which best practice is right for you and which has the right impact. Don't just rely on best practice, drive it from your data. Another one that comes around is people get surprised sometimes that there are browser updates that go on. And they happen regularly, and they happen all the time, and often you're not told about them. But one thing is, they break forms. So if you're lucky, it will be a really big break and you'll spot it right away, your revenue will fall off a cliff. But the ones you should worry about are those small breaks that you don't spot. So you need to start tracking these. So the other day, for example, we found that there was a retailer that suddenly there was an update that impacted iOS users on Safari, which completely stopped the buy button working overnight. Now, luckily that was a fairly large one, and they had a sophisticated system to spot it. But often you'll see these things happen. It won't be spotted for months later, and then when you work out the lost revenue, it's significant. So the insight you get from a form, so not only is a form about filling in data, but actually tells you as an organisation a huge amount. So a couple of things we find. So sliders are very interesting in the financial services sector, which are often part of a form process. We find people who use those in different ways are a very good indicator of credit risk. Or we find if you're actually looking at form performance, it's not just when somebody clicks to submit, it's what they do pre-click. So, for example, sometimes you'll see a form where someone enters the data in 4 or 5 times before pressing submit. Just understanding and capturing that tells you a huge amount. Or, for example, in financial services, sometimes you'll see people doing this with loans. So, for a loan purpose, it might be 5k holiday, then no 5k school fees, no 5k holiday, no 5k house repairs. What does that person really want the money for? Are they gaming the system for best rates? But understanding that tells you a lot. Other thing just to bear in mind is that most forms are under attack every day and every week by bots. So sometimes we've seen 40% in some cases, which absolutely skews your data. So 2 things here. Strip the bots out and know where they're there, but also sometimes you can have competitor bots coming in to capture particularly price data. So one thing is, do you want to strip them out, or do you want to give them a synthetic set of data? So just something to look at. It's also tempting actually when you start looking at dropout rates and forms and customers who drop out to discard them. But certainly what we find is large numbers of people who drop out spend between a minute and a half on a form, which is a huge amount of time. So are they really disengaged people, or are they trying? So often it can be a really rich group of customers to target and segment. I think just sort of coming towards the end here now, a couple of things I'll sort of finish up with is remember your site and your form and your journey is not in isolation, it's part of the web. So So a classic one we see is that social channels are a phenomenal feeder of traffic to forms, but often a poor converter. So typically what we see here is that someone might come from Facebook, which is highly user-centric, very social, highly mobile optimized, and they hit someone's form, which is a Stone Age form in the mobile, where it's asking for every piece of information, and just kills that user experience dead, particularly when they've come from one extreme to the other. So just, when you're solving your forms, you actually need to look upstream and downstream of what that traffic's done to get a good view of it. The other thing is that when we talk to marketing teams, we often get the answer is, well, I actually don't really do data because it's difficult, so the answer is, well, I'll spend another £1 or another $1 on PPC. I think the great things when you're looking at forms is it's a really good place for a non-analytic person to start with. So you find some of the tools out there which really analyse forms well, provide really good, simple reports, easy to digest, that then start boiling down to actions rather than just data. So just to finish up, I think a couple of things I just leave with everybody is, first of all, when you're measuring these things, get down right to the pound impact, to the bottom line that changes make and your forms get to. Just make sure you're asking the right questions. So do you actually even know how many forms you have and the impact on revenue that changes? And in terms of getting to the right part of forms, it's not a quick fix. It's actually a process and an ongoing process, so make sure you have got the right tool there. And recognise forms are part of the journey. So once you've got to a stage on your forms, you may get more return then looking at acquisition or other parts of the journey. So you just need to understand the return on forms. But also recognise they're never done. So often people say to us, what do I do when I've done my forms? Because that's probably a month or two's worth of effort. Well, they're not, because things do change. And really look at the data to tell you what to do. Listen to best practice and use that as guidance. The other thing we say is just start acting, and acting in terms of just get some stuff done, and we find small steps are fine, but start doing things. So as a summary from me, my email address is there if you need any help. Send some questions across if you need. Over to the rest of the team now. Thank you.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks, Jonathan. Before we kick off our panel discussion, just a final poll question. If we can get it up, please, Priscilla. What is the greatest barrier to effective form optimization for your business? The options here, in no particular order, are lack of business case, poor technology, no ownership, lack of knowledge, and no budget. Okay. Okay, great. Let's move on now to the questions which are starting to come through, which is great. We'll take the first question, if I can put this to, I think the guys at Foster, it's how do you prove the business case internally for investment in form optimization?
So good question, and it all comes down to numbers. So typically, if you haven't got any data, you don't know. So you need some data to start with, but typically where we start with is, well, if you're losing 90% of your traffic, that's actually a huge amount of value on the table. So very quickly you can work out the value of that 90%. Now, I'm not saying you're going to go and suddenly convert all that 90% of traffic, but that gives you a starting point. Then it's really a question of getting some data on your forms, perhaps putting in a low cost, or even a lot of tools will offer you a free trial. Drop those in. That will then give you the specific numbers you need to say, well, look, here's the top 3 problems with our forms, and any sensible tool will also put a dollar value on that, which also helps because not only does it give you a business case for analysing it, but also when you spot the fix it needs doing, typically we find there's quite a long IT backlog, so if you find there's a problem that's £1 million, that certainly focuses getting it on on the build schedule rather than perhaps a marginally negligible valuable one. So that's where we start.
Okay. Leah, anything to add there?
No, I think Jonathan covered it. I think it varies between different companies, depending on what size they are, depending on what they're focused on in terms of their industry. But the business case becomes more urgent, for a small company that's growing and spending money on a lot of marketing. Making sure that their forms are in the correct order and that they're working well enough so they don't actually lose their marketing expense in the process, versus somebody who is more mature, like Jonathan's mentioning, where the backlog of issues constitutes the value that would be gained in terms of making an investment in forms optimization. So I think it really can depend upon business, industry, size of company, and that sort of thing, because the budget is more meaningful for a smaller company that's going out and doing marketing versus trying to kind of shift and focus on retention-based aspects that a larger company might have.
Okay, great. Leah, it'd also be good to hear from you around any, whether there are any tips. Someone's asking for measuring the effectiveness of form optimization.
I think tip-wise, some of the things that Jonathan discussed in the presentation are pretty key. The challenges of having very segmented data or different streams of data that are measuring different types of input, like what kinds of devices your customers are using, and how connected is their data, so you don't sort of burden them with redundancy in terms of the experience. I think that sort of, finding something that can reconcile those pieces of information and pull them into a consolidated view so you can actually see something comprehensively versus looking at a problem in bits and pieces and then trying to formulate this calculation that sits in the middle to make a guess at what the best form optimization might be to start with. Sometimes it's very simple and obvious, but other times it can be just a matter of not seeing things in proper context. So I think in terms of measurement, thinking through some of the ways that you can actually connect different bits of data that are already within your organization, or find something that helps to do that, can reveal a lot of subtle things that you might be missing because it's too familiar to you, or it's not entirely obvious to you because you're close to the problem, or you can't quite see where the disconnects are happening. So in that case, something that really gives you the data back and gives you a reference point for pulling things together.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Questions here around who should own form optimization within the business. If we could go to James for this one.
Fundamentally, the person who has the responsibility for optimizing the website.
James, any thoughts on that?
So the person who's responsible for optimizing the website, so quite likely the e-commerce manager.
So I think that it's interesting how it does vary between businesses and organisations. So typically we see it a combination within the sort of marketing department is one area, so around e-commerce directors and e-commerce managers. Though then we find actually executing those changes typically sits within the engineering department. So I think the thing we found which is key here is that it's actually making sure all the departments have the data to understand what's going on. So typically form optimization, there's people who spot the issues, there's people who might do some modelling and research the issues, then there's people who've got to sign the budgets off, and then there's people who've got to actually do the build. So the ownership actually tends to be across lots of departments. So the key differentiator we find is if everybody's got access to clear data that shows what's going on, and having the data takes it away from a subjective view, then it just makes for a much better decision-making process across the business, because inevitably it does sit across a number of areas.
Okay, great. And the question that's come in from a Toba was around how the approach to form optimization might vary between industries. Anyone like to pick that one up?
Just one observation we have between industries. So yes, it does vary. Let me give you an example we had the other day. Was that we were doing a lot of work in the insurance sector, and the perceived wisdom was to get people off call centres and onto online as the lowest cost to serve channel. But certainly we found in the likes of insurance, actually there are quite large groups of customers that you actually need to do the opposite. You need to take them from online forms and actually push them to a call centre. And give you an example, in that scenario, this client had a 25% increase in conversion rates by doing that. So I think it's just recognising that yes, we all focus on our online forms, but actually we're here to make money from customers and increase revenue. And sometimes there are other ways we need to serve. So that's particularly in financial services, where we've seen some other industries, typically retail, where pushing people through to a form or an online call, phone call centre is probably less relevant. I don't know if anyone else has got anything to add to that.
Leah?
I think, I think just with the insurance example, the form process is so lengthy, but if you look at something like a media company where they're primarily focused on engaging you with content or, some sort of video or different type of media, and the sort of outcome for them in terms of what their conversion is getting a digital subscription or a print subscription or, some sort of enrollment in regular communications with them. The process for actually going through a form is quite short. And in this case, I think it shifts to some of what's happening before they actually get to that form and trying to build efficiency around things like that. So, where an insurance agency or an insurance company is taking you through a very important multi-stage process, and you're kind of coming into it from a different place, the funnel that actually, connects to conversion for a media company is going to be quite different. And the things that you're going to be looking at are going to be quite different. So even though the form process is quite short, some of the data and the analysis that sits ahead of that is critical to whether you actually have success taking them through a form and building into meaningful conversion.
Okay, great. Let's try James again. Can we hear from you, James? We've had a slight technical problem there.
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me?
Back on. Yeah, that's great. You're back on.
The randomness of technology. I think just to echo what the others have said, that for me it's coming back to use case modelling and what is the objective of the form that you're trying to create. For example, in B2B software companies, they do a lot of lead generation forms and they put a lot of free valuable content out there in order to drive registration, and in exchange for which they capture richer data about the people so they can profile and do onward lead management. There is an expectation that when there's a value exchange between great high-value content that you will give more data. So that's fine. Well, then you look at other industries, you look at travel, for example, and the same as they were saying about insurance, there's multi-phase form management. So they cut it down very intelligently into the simple info you have to give to find a product, then the info that they need from a regulatory point of view in order to book and secure your ticket, and then the additional information they need in order for you to travel. For example, flights, capturing travel documentation and passport numbers that don't have to happen in the checkout, but can happen through the kind of account management piece afterwards. So I think the key thing here is people in different industries and different companies stop and think about the use cases of each step of the form process and then model the form fields accordingly.
Okay, great. A question, you might have some thoughts on this, James, as well. We've had come in from a Sam, was around captures on forms, which can be quite annoying for the user experience. What are your thoughts on those? They can obviously be useful for keeping out the bots.
Yeah, I'm torn on this because I've seen data that's shown that it can really annoy people. I think that there's only one answer to here because there's never a definitive black and white. So, number one, do you have a problem on your form capture where you're getting lots of spam forms and lots of bot traffic? If the answer is yes, and you can validate that quite easily through the analytics, if the answer is yes, then that would suggest that looking at a capture form is a sensible thing to try and improve that. You can then implement and test and measure. Now, does that kill form completion rates for non-spam traffic? But you have to put the data behind it. And for some sites, capture might work, and for other sites, it doesn't. So I think you just have to test it and validate it on your own audience.
Yeah, just a comment from my experience here is that it's the wrong solution for a problem. So if you're getting attacked by bots, you need to solve it. But actually, you would never choose to put a capture code to improve your form or your funnel. So I think it's one of those that people just shouldn't do it, but solve the problem another way. And I agree, it's personally as annoying as anything having it there. So yeah.
Okay, no, it's really interesting, guys. Time for one more question before we wrap up. We're coming up to the hour. Do you know, or how do you track how much revenue you're losing from your forms? Maybe Leah or Jonathan could pick this up.
Yeah, Leah, do you want to have a first go at that one?
Yeah, I mean, something we were just recently looking at was sort of a not a very old company, but one that's doing a huge amount of marketing, and so in terms of they're spending a lot of money to acquire a lot of customers, and the revenues are seeing the benefit, but some of their form decisions and just where they're investing in terms of how their web and mobile presence is lining up with some of their marketing, it is having an impact on retention. So they're doing very well with acquisition, but they're having some problems with retention. And some of this is tied to critical points in terms of how their revenue is captured from their customers. And so in this case, their initial design of the form to actually take payment information, it allows you to enter the information correctly. You can set everything up in terms of being activated as a customer, but there's no way for anyone to go back and actually edit the card that is being used. So in terms of the revenue impact of how this is how much revenue they're actually losing from forms, it's a pretty bad customer experience if they have something happen where their card is lost, their expiration date is hit, or any of the other things that you can have happen with a card that you're using. In terms of being able to retain that customer, this is a pretty critical point because they're processing revenue and it's not going to continue if somebody can't re-enter their card. So in terms of the revenue impact, they're seeing net loss and net loss of customers that they spent a lot of money to acquire in the first place. And because they're a small business, this is crucial to them actually being able to have continued and sustained growth. Versus, the other option is people are creating duplicate accounts in which it's showing this false attrition. So they haven't actually lost the customer, but the customer is trying to work around a problem that's actually part of their form. And for this particular company, it's within the first year of their business. So things like this can't go undealt with. And it's really a matter of priority and shifting that. So in terms of how much revenue you're losing from your forms, the calculation is hard to determine here because you have to differentiate between how many customers are actually just giving up and then how many customers are actually creating duplicate accounts, which are skewing your numbers entirely. So the hard number is a little bit hard to determine in this case, but the problem being identified is most critical. And so this is what we've seen just looking at this particular business and some of the challenges that they're hitting as a growing company.
Okay. Thanks, Leah. Jonathan, a couple of words to wrap up. I think Leah's done a great job on that one.
I think just in summary, I think it's very easy to think you have your forms under control, but it's an area certainly worth making sure you've got data on it to really understand what the impact is and the level of opportunity there. So I'd say, at the very least, get a tool on board, find out what's going on, and so you can drive it by the data.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap things up there. So I just need to thank you all for joining the webinar. Let you know that the webcast recording will be available. We'll be in touch about that. I'd also like to thank FOSFA for sponsoring this webinar, and our panelists, obviously Jonathan, Leah from FOSFA, and James Gerd. And as I mentioned earlier, do look out for our checkout report, which will be made available for free from ClickZ Intelligence very soon. And I'm sorry if I haven't tackled your questions, but thank you very much indeed. Cheers.